It's the 23rd day of July, Monday. And again, I want to thank Gary Hindershot for coming on and co-hosting with me for the first hour. If you want to hear his regularly weekly program on Justin TV, it is every Thursday, 9 p.m. East Coast time. Go to Justin TV, just type in The Smart Scarecrow Show, and you will get your fill of alternative energy. All right, in just a minute, I'm going to bring up literally, and she probably thinks I'm just really sucking up, but she's one of my favorite writers when it comes to covering the debt game, the banking industry, the crimes that are happening to this planet, the crimes that are happening to this country and the rest of the planet at the same time. We're going to bring Ellen on here in just a second. Now, I just uploaded a video. And the video, the name of it is The Next Scam, and I'm gonna talk about it a little bit before we bring Ellen on, because I want her to address this as well. And I know if I talk about it for 2 or 3 minutes, we can't help but then to continue the discussion on it. And the next con is this. The next scam is this. You know, in the midst of all that's happening around this planet, sovereign debt bubbles are starting to pop around the planet. We've seen the largest transfer of wealth, I believe, in the history of mankind, from fraudulent private failure onto the backs of the people of not only this country, but the world. And what is the next engine of opportunity, the next exotic investment vehicle coming out now? It isn't mortgage-backed security. See, they played that game. They played that game, and when that blew up in 2008, we started an onslaught of foreclosures, over 1 million a year since that time, millions of bankruptcies since that time. Property values, the people that relied on their home to be their number one asset. This is what the middle class based their asset wealth on, was their home itself. We've seen it fall further than the Great Depression. So there's no gain for Wall Street. There's no gain for the banking cabal to do the mortgage-backed securities scam. They've already done it. So what's the next one? It's going to be rental-backed securities. I can't even make this up. A lot of people wondered why. In January of this year, the Federal Reserve sent a memorandum to the Congress, the Congressional Banking Committee, as if Congress truly wrote laws that oversaw the banking industry, when we know it's 180 degrees from that. The banking industry writes laws that govern themselves. But the Federal Reserve nonetheless sent a memorandum in January of this year supporting and endorsing taking foreclosed properties and turning them into rental properties. That's right. The American people now own trillions of dollars worth of these mortgages, 5.75 million right now, as we do this show tonight in July of 2012, 5.75 million are in some form of default or foreclosure as we speak, on top of the millions that have already been foreclosed on. So this is an opportunity for Wall Street to securitize yet another product and sell it around the world and make a bunch of money on it. This is not a joke. This isn't pretending. This is an actual event that's occurring right now. We have Citi, Wells Fargo, and other too big to fail institutions that are looking at how they can possibly securitize the rental market and use that as their next generator of economic fortune. Again, we see the people of the country, fill in the blank. It isn't just the United States. It's every country that considers themselves a free country at this point, that has a central banking cabal overseeing the true government behind the so-called representative government. Every nation on this planet is suffering right now by the acts of these too big to fail institutions. And not only have they not been reined in with joke legislation like Dodd-Frank, not only are they less systemic than they were before the 2008 crisis, they're far more systemic. They're writing laws that govern not only themselves, but govern the countries of the world. They are the ones in charge of what's going to happen next, and we can see the path that we're on. Look at Europe right now. Look at Greece. They're in a depression. 6 countries out of the 17 that use the euro as their currency are in official mainstream admitted recession, and it promises to only get worse. We have millions of people protesting in the street of Spain over the last couple of weeks. We have people inside of Greece who've lost all hope and literally killing themselves in front of Parliament. This is all due to onerous debt that is being dumped onto the people because corrupt politicians refuse to represent the people. They are representing special interests that is funding their rise to power in the political class. All right, let's bring Ellen Brown on, because I'm sure she has something to say about all this. Ellen Brown, you're Your list of articles that I've read from you are 5 miles long. Every one of them is, I think, perfectly right, spot on. And I thank you very much for joining us. I do want to mention her book that she's famous for is Web of Debt. Her website is webofdebt.com, and she's also the president of the Public Banking Institute, and you can check that out at publicbankinginstitute.org. Ellen Brown, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks, Charlie.
Well, you heard me. I don't know if you had a chance to see this today. I know it wasn't in any of the articles I sent to you, but I caught this late in the day. We're going to securitize rental properties now, Ellen.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's shocking. I mean, you can just imagine, at least, well, when they started securitizing mortgages, one problem was that the bank itself was no longer owned this mortgage, and so they didn't have a personal interest in it. When you had your friendly local bank was your mortgagor, you could go, or mortgagee, I forget which it is, you could go to the bank, and talk to them and reason with them, and you had a friendly relationship. But then when they started selling off the mortgages, they had no personal interest, and so there was nobody that you could really negotiate with. Now what are you going to do when they sell off your rentals? Who's gonna fix things when they fall apart in your house? Who's going to be responsible? They'll all say that it's not our problem, it's somebody else.
That's exactly right.
And the banks are going to take a big cut for what? For shuffling paper around. We don't really need those middlemen.
No, we absolutely don't. And the fact is, there is a lot of regional banks. I'm good friends with the vice president of a local regional bank who did everything right. They made sure they had the 15-20% down. They made sure that they had a vested interest in that property. They didn't create a mortgage and then sell it off just to generate some quick income. And these regional institutions are the ones that are falling by the wayside at record numbers, thousands of them since 2008. In fact, I believe we used to have somewhere near 10,000 banks in this country, and it's under 8,000. I believe it's under 7,000 at this point. And most of these are not the too big to fails. These are the small regional guys. Some of them haven't even got into residential mortgages. They were into commercial real estate, but because the whole economy was decimated, because of shenanigans happening on Wall Street, in my opinion, they are forced to realize loss on these commercial loans, and a lot of these banks have completely just went out of business.
And it was because the banks did not actually own these mortgages and didn't care about whether they got paid. They were going to sell them off, that they didn't worry about whether the borrowers were going to be able to pay, and that's why you have all these subprime loans. So the investors also got screwed, and that would happen with rentals as well. I mean, nobody's going to be checking to make sure that these renters are going to necessarily take care of the property or pay up. That you can just imagine the investors are going to once again be screwed unless they're sharp enough to.
Right, and of course it'll be polished up like this glowing, golden, never-ending flow of cash from these rental properties, but you're 100% right. The rating agencies will get involved, and they'll say, the people always need a place to live, and they'll stamp them AAA, and we'll see all this money pour into it. But you're right. You'll have the asset, which is the house, being who's taking care of it, who's overseeing
exactly.
it. So just yet another scam, and it's amazing to me that here we sit after 4 years of the planet bailout, and we're still having the same companies talking about the same kind of exotic investment vehicles. It's absolutely crazy. Go ahead.
There is another plan that I don't know if you were reading about in San Bernardino. The plan to have the city take over these properties by eminent domain. But in San Bernardino, there's a private company that would then get money from investors and buy them up at fair market value. I mean, you have to pay fair market value to the banks, but that's only half what the mortgages themselves are right now. So then you could sell them back to the same homeowners for half what their mortgage is now. So supposedly everybody would win. But the problem is you've got this private middleman again that's going to take a nice cut. I think 5% they're expecting to get, and probably it's going to be the county that's left holding the bag. But at the Public Banking Institute, our idea on that was that you would have county banks that would. We have one state-owned bank, the Bank of North Dakota,
right.
and that's our whole public banking model. And they take the revenues of the state, put them in the bank, and then they leverage them into. You can do much more with your money if you're creating credit out of it than if you're just spending it outright. In other words, if you use that for your capital, you need 8% capital, so you can create 12 times your capital in loans. And so let's say your county bank takes all its county revenues, puts it in the bank, the county bank. Then they take over these properties by eminent domain. What I would suggest is only go for the properties that have MERS in the chain of title, the mortgage electronic registration systems, because courts are increasingly and make sure you're in a jurisdiction where the courts already are holding that MERS breaks the chain of title. So then you can put an ad in the local paper and say, we, the county, are taking over these properties by eminent domain because it's in the best interest of the residential area, the blighted, foreclosed, abandoned properties, the ones that are bringing down the property values for everyone else. We're going to take those over, and if anyone can prove title, we'll pay fair market value. So that puts the burden on the banks. Right now, the burden is on the homeowners to prove that the banks have broken the chain of title, and they can't afford a lawyer, and they're afraid. They don't know about this defense, so they don't do anything.
Sure.
But if you put the burden on the bank to prove that they do have title, they're not going to be able to prove it because they have broken the chain of title by selling it off to this, or by using the cover of this electronic database. I mean, there are many reasons why the chain of title has been broken. They haven't complied with the provisions of their REMICs, the real estate mortgage insurance conduits, which is how they take investor money. It's all very complicated. But anyway, it appears to me that they probably are not going to be able to pay or prove title. So the county could get these properties for free. But the problem is that these are probably already had vandalism, etc. They're going to need some fixing up. So then you take your county bank and generate credit to fix up the properties, and then you sell them or rent them or do some sort of workout with the prior owners if they're still around. You do whatever is fair. But because you are the county, you're doing what is in the best interests of the people collectively, and the profits are going to go back to the people collectively. So they will reduce our taxes, or they will increase the amount of money that our
and it's in the hands of local government at that point too. You brought up the North Dakota. That's a neighboring state that is the only state in the union that has a state bank. And in Montana in 2011, in the legislature, there was a bill brought to the floor. Now it was defeated, but they're still working hard. We only have a legislature every 2 years in Montana. They're working hard to try to use North Dakota as a model to have a state-run bank, because it makes all the sense in the world and makes no sense why and right now I believe it's U.S. Bank gets all the money from the state of Montana. It all goes to a Wall Street firm where they're making their cut on it, and if that money stayed in state, you're right, you could leverage this. I think what the ultimate goal, and tell me if I'm wrong, I haven't even been to your website yet, but as far as I've been to Web of Debt, but not Public Banking Institute, it's about government issuing credit, not banks issuing credit. Because when a bank does it, it's always tied to interest. If a government does it, then it's done on behalf of the people that are being governed, correct? Which is hopefully a self-governing state.
Right. So if it's a government project, effectively the government gets it interest free because they own the bank. I mean, you can charge interest just to please the rating agencies, so it doesn't look like you're giving yourself something for free, but you own the bank, so you get those profits. That's in North Dakota. They give a very nice dividend to the state every year. They have, I think it was between 19 and 26% return on equity ever since 2008. So you're returning those profits to the state, which means to the people. And interest now composes 40% on average of everything we buy and of every public project. So if you can eliminate the interest, you get your project for 40% less than before, for virtually half of what you're paying now. So either you can have twice as many projects, or you can cut your taxes in half. There are many nice things you could do with this benefit.
Right, and let's mention that North Dakota has 3% unemployment, and now there's going to be people that are listening to me say, well, yeah, but they have the Bakken oil reserve, and they have, there's a big oil boom going there, and that is true. But so does Montana. We have the Bakken as well, and we're sitting here below the national average, but we're still hovering around 7% by the U3 number. The fiscal health of North Dakota, they didn't even realize anything happened in 2008. They were sound and solid because they had a state bank. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and what the bank does, they're building roads and hotels, and they're taking care of all those people that want to come in and develop. It's one thing to have resources in the ground, but you need the infrastructure to get them to market, and for that you need loans. You need low interest loans, and that's what the Bank of North Dakota does. It doesn't make commercial loans directly usually, but it partners with the local banks, which then are able to make much bigger loans than they could have before, and at much more reasonable terms than they could before.
Absolutely, and it's not some miracle that this occurred. This is how the nation is supposed to be. We're supposed to be issuing money ourselves. We're not supposed to be. We were never set up. Our Constitution wasn't set up to have a central bank that is privately owned issue money at debt. And how on earth can we, like you said, if 40% of everything that happens is first and foremost debt, come on, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that you create more than can ever be paid back. In fact, you have to keep growing it. You have to keep growing the debt in the system that we have now, and we see the results of it. The world is literally in chaos financially over it.
Yeah, I read somewhere recently that there's 32 trillion. They weren't sure of the figure, but the amount of money that's offshored, and it's just sitting in these capital accounts. Well, what that money is, besides the fact that they're not paying taxes on it, which is shocking in itself, that money it's like this big island of money that's not involved in the real economy. It's sitting there making money. It's a parasite on the economy that's just sucking more money out all the time. And I shouldn't even say they. We all do it. I have stocks, and I watch them go up sometimes or go down. But, everybody wants their money to be making money. It's sort of a need of Americans, because I think largely because we don't have basic securities. Like in Europe, I was just there, people are so much more laid back. Say in Sweden, they pay 50% in taxes, but we actually pay almost 50% in taxes when you take all the hidden taxes. And they have their healthcare covered, their old age covered, and their higher education covered. So they don't worry. They can spend their time, fishing and, they can live a little more, and they take a little more time off on weekends because they don't have this insatiable drive to always be accumulating.
Yeah, and I'm not sure, and I know the article you're talking about. I saw it this morning. Rich hide up to $32 trillion in offshore tax havens. At $32 trillion. That's
twice
double
the GDP. Yeah.
Well, right, it's double our national debt right now as well. Right. But I think the whole premise of living in order to grow money, in order to keep up with inflation, in order to keep up with debt, is a horrible economic model, and I think it ends up the same every time we look throughout history. It always ends up the same. You end up with a massive depression. You end up, in more than likely some kind of global war, which is, what we're on the fast track for now, Ellen.
Mm-hmm.
Not to take away from Sweden. I like Sweden. I've been there several times, in Europe as well. I told you before the program I lived there for 4 years, and you're right. I go to Canada quite a bit. And matter of fact, I was just up there a few weeks ago, and I was sitting around, and it's amazing to me. They're more in tune, it seems like, with what's going on politically and financially in the United States than most Americans I talk to. I think primarily because those 30 million people, they have a vested interest in what their big brother to the south is doing. But, we got the break coming here. So, the fact is, we denigrate them for their system, right? They pay 30% in taxes. We pay more taxes than they do. We pay more taxes than they do, and then we're conned into believing this is free market capitalism here because we don't have health care paid for, excuse me, by the government. My cough's coming on because it's break time. All right, we're going to take a break. We'll be back with Ellen Brown and more Wide Awake News Radio in 5.5 minutes. Stay tuned. I'm Charlie McGrath. Ellen Brown is our guest tonight. And before we run out of time, because I'm sure we could go down any road and it would burn up the last half hour of the program. One of her latest articles, I'm pretty sure this is, July 22nd, so this is very recent, had to do with the LIBOR scam, the LIBOR deal. Now, we hear the name thrown around mainstream media. In fact, Kudlow came out the other day and said it's a victimless crime. And, Ellen, what I'd like you to do is maybe break down what exactly happened and how this is far from a victimless crime.
Well, LIBOR is the rate at which banks borrow from each other. It's the London Interbank Offering Rate. And it's set by 16 banks, 16 big, the biggest banks.
Sure.
Internationally. 3 of them are U.S. banks, and they're 3 of the 4 largest U.S. banks, of course. That's Bank of America, J.P. Morgan, and what's the other one? Citigroup. So they are supposed to report every day what rate they think they can borrow from the other banks at, and then putting all those together, you get the LIBOR rate. Well, Barclays in England was caught fudging their results, and they've done this for a long time and repeatedly. And it was in emails. It was proven that they did it, and then to avoid liability, they ratted on everybody else, basically, including they said that Federal Reserve and the Bank of England they implicated them as well. So this is something like $500 trillion worth of contracts of various sorts, derivatives and mortgages and all sorts of contracts. Their interest rate is based on the LIBOR rates. So this is the ground that's supposed to be the stable basis of all our contracts, and it's not stable at all. The whole thing is fraudulent. So there are all sorts of lawsuits that are forming about this. Some of them are RICO suits, which is racketeering, for which you can get treble damages. And if you consider all those 500 trillion in contracts,
sure,
this is a huge potential liability for the banks. But they'll probably figure out some way to get out of it. But what you were talking about, where sorry, who was it who said it was a victimless crime?
Kudlow, Larry Kudlow.
Oh, right.
Let me just elaborate a little bit, because a lot of people think, especially when you have mainstream media figures like Larry Kudlow coming out and say it's a victimless crime. Look, everything. In fact, the business that I go to every day use LIBOR, our operating line of credit, which is millions of dollars. It was tied to LIBOR for the longest time. We've since changed, and it's no longer tied to LIBOR, the interest rate that we pay on our operating line. But it isn't just great big banks that are affected by this. It is small businesses like the one I work for. It is municipalities. It's cities and counties and states. They all have some kind of debt obligation that is usually tied to LIBOR in one form or another. That's how you get the $500 trillion.
Yeah, well, and derivatives. I mean, there's no way you get that kind of numbers unless you start talking about derivatives.
Right.
So what Kudlow would be talking about was that they were actually manipulating the rate downward. So you would say, well, that's got to help the homeowners if the rates are lower than they really are. But the bigger liability, 82% of derivatives involve interest rate swaps. And these are all your municipalities, pension funds, hospitals. They were all induced by Wall Street to enter into these interest rate swaps, supposedly to protect their interest rates on their bonds from going up. And then interest rates dropped to almost zero. So the effect of these swaps was that they swapped their good rate for a really bad rate, basically. I mean, they're actually stuck with this 5% rate that they started with instead of the almost nothing rate that they could be getting. So you might say, well, a deal's a deal, and they're just complaining because they got the raw end of they gambled and lost. But the thing is, it was a totally rigged loss. It was the Federal Reserve that set these rates at almost zero, and the Federal Reserve is the head of the banking system. We know, it's 12 branches, all of which are 100% privately owned by the banks in their district. And it's basically the bankers' union. And it's set up, even the mandate in the Federal Reserve Act, it's set up to serve the banks. So the Federal Reserve is the biggest manipulator of all. I mean, they're allowed blatantly to go out there and manipulate interest rates. So they just announced that they're going to set the Fed funds rate at almost zero, 0.25%. So that meant that all these cities, counties, et cetera, that have these interest rate swaps are paying huge sums in interest that they didn't need to be paying. And to get out of these deals, they have to pay exorbitant fees. So you have cities like Oakland that they've shut down all these schools. It's just pathetic what's happening in Oakland. They just have no money. And it's because a major chunk of their budgets goes to pay interest that they don't need to be paying. And it's not just the interest, but it's all these fees, et cetera. So Wall Street's making out like bandits, and the municipalities are getting seriously screwed. Absolutely.
And I did pull a question out of the chat, which I'm just going to throw it out there because I don't know when's going to be a good time. I do want to elaborate a little bit more on what could happen, and with the LIBOR lawsuits. But I think you said it earlier in there that there will be a deal that is cut. It's just like MERS. It's just like anything that these banks do. They're going to catch a slight slap on the wrist. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, off the top of my head, Goldman Sachs paid $500 million in fines for its dealings with AIG, their backdoor bailout, and misrepresenting portfolios. Paid $500.
And they got $20 billion out of the deal.
Yeah, they got $20 billion. So I mean, it's a rounding error for the boys at Goldman Sachs. But the question came in was, please ask Ellen when she sees the collapse of the dollar. And I don't know, do you want to elaborate on that at all? Do you see a dollar?
No, I don't think it's going to collapse. I mean, they've been saying that it was going to collapse for years, and it never does. Everything is manipulated. The whole market is completely manipulated. It will collapse if and when the elite decide they want it to collapse. And if they don't want it to collapse, they will prop it up. And the way they prop it up is, one is with these interest rate swaps. JP Morgan has $57 trillion in interest rate swaps. That's the biggest part of their revenues.
That's derivatives. That's right, correct?
Yeah, they are derivatives, right?
Yeah. So the notional value, $57 trillion, and we've seen, I believe it was JP Morgan, it was about a year ago, it was announced that they moved a lot of this derivative exposure from JP, or from maybe it was from Merrill into JP Morgan, the unit that is publicly backed. So if this all blew up, it ends up being a taxpayer problem as well.
True in theory, but I don't. I think it'll blow up if they want it to blow up, and because it's so complicated and nobody understands it. They seem to be able to sweep virtually anything under the rug. I think that whole $3 billion, now $9 billion or whatever it is that JP Morgan lost over. I think that was just kind of window dressing. I mean, they've got much bigger things going on, probably. That's just sort of...
I couldn't agree with you more, and I also couldn't agree with you more on the fact that it isn't going to come apart until they're ready for it to come apart. You better make sure that isn't Sweden calling.
Well, That's my good microphone, sorry.
It is a great microphone. I can hear everything happening in that place. But you're right. I mean, the system isn't going to come apart until it is time for it to come apart. And we can look at what's happening inside of Europe right now, Ellen. You know, we see representative government under assault inside of Europe. You have 17. You know, a lot of people think that they're further down the road to socialism in Europe than they are here, and I can make the argument that that's exactly opposite of the way it is. We have our entire nation being controlled by a cabal of banksters, right? In the Federal Reserve, they control the government. They issue a memorandum saying yes, it's very much okay, and we support and condone changing foreclosure properties into rentals, and poof, it happens. Well, inside of Europe, the Eurozone, 17 nations that use the currency, you have 17 governments that have to say, I've taken this back to my people. They don't want to participate in the EU bailout. So you have leaders removed, you have technocrats installed. So, when crisis can be used to force action, it will be. And so when it's time to let the derivatives bomb go off or the sovereign debt bubble burst, they will. They'll use it in order to further their elite agenda. And I think that agenda has been announced long before now, which is they want to consolidate power. They want to consolidate banking power into fewer and fewer hands. That's why we hear Tim Geithner, before he was, or as he was making transition from the head of the New York Federal Reserve to our Treasury Secretary, talking about how we needed more global financial governance. Jean-Claude Trichet said the exact same thing when he was the head of the European Central Bank. So they will use crisis in order to in order to get the desired effect that they need to implement their agenda. And until then, they'll keep floating this system on hopes and dreams, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, our whole thing is that the only way out, we can't do anything on the federal level. It's obviously locked up and we're powerless. But we do there is still hope on the local level. You can still talk to your councilman, etc. So the way they get away with saying they're too big to fail is that they're the only game in town. But if we set up our own game, if we set up our own banking system, then we can just let them fail. We could just move over. Well, you have your whole move your money movement, but then the question is, move it into what? There are many advantages to a big international bank, actually. A credit union can't do the things that a big international bank can. If you travel internationally, you kind of need some of those services. But if we could set up state banks like the Bank of North Dakota, and we had a whole chain of them, right, and we had our own just sort of system that started at the grassroots and went up instead of starting at the top and came down.
Well, yeah, I don't think, I've not met anybody in this journey that is, anti-bank. They're anti-too big to fail bank. They're anti-bank that is above the government, in effect becomes the government. I mean, that I think is the problem. It's not the regional banks or the credit unions. It's the banks that are deciding the financial destiny of nations, and they're doing it not for the will of the people, not by the will of the people. They're doing it by the will of the profit.
Mm-hmm. There are 4 banks that own 96% of derivatives, and those, of course, are our biggest banks. And they're not making loans to local businesses. They've totally lost interest in that. They are speculating in the things that actually hurt us. They're betting against us in these derivative bets.
Absolutely.
So yeah, so they are the enemy, and it's our local banks that we want to support. I mean, somebody's got to be making loans locally.
So in California, is there, because you mentioned North Dakota, I know in Montana there's a push for state bank. Is California is the Wall Street grips too?
Well, we had a bill. There was a bill introduced last February, a year ago, and it passed both houses of the legislature, which was amazing. we were quite excited about that, but the governor didn't sign it. It was a bill for a feasibility study, And the governor said, oh, we don't need any more committees. We can do this in-house. We already have a banking committee. But of course, that's going to be the end of it. It won't, the banking committee, we have no way of making the banking committee do anything. So then another bill was brought this last spring by the same man in San Diego, Ben Hoyso, for an actual state bank. But it was pretty obvious that that was not going to get out of committee, and so he withdrew it and is still planning to bring it again. But it's slow going. Ultimately, someday, I think it would be good to do an initiative. I mean, to just put it on the people themselves. But first, the people have to understand what you're talking about, and right now they don't. You know, if you went into a supermarket and you said, "Would you like to sign my petition for a state bank?" They probably wouldn't sign it. They wouldn't know.
You know what you'd hear, Ellen? This is what you would hear. I don't want the government to have anything to do with money. I don't want the government in the banking sector.
Right.
And it's, you know, you want to smack them and say, you know what? The government isn't in the money. It isn't in the banking sector. The banking sector is controlling government.
The government. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And the government is us. We want the banking sector. We want all the perks the banks get, and that's how we can do it.
Well, we need to be able, we the people, need to be able to create credit. We need to be able to create the money that regulates commerce, and not the other way around, because we see exactly what we get. Let me ask you. We only have about 3 minutes left. I mean, you see the crisis we're in here financially. You see the crisis in Europe. Where do you see it going? I mean, we see laws being written of, by, and for the banks. We see the problems just compounding. They're not getting any better. None of this debt's going away. None of the derivatives are going away. I mean, they're just compounding on themselves, and eventually this is all going to come to an end. But what do you see happening in the coming months?
Well, for some reason, I'm an optimist. But so if we take in the European situation, there is that I wrote an article on the European Stability Mechanism, which was a clear power play on the part of the banks to be 100% underwritten by the taxpayers. Yes. And they've almost pulled it off, but now Germany the ball is in Germany's court, and there are 12,000 protesters who are objecting to the European Stability Mechanism, and so the courts are looking at it. So that will drag it on for months and months, and hopefully the courts will agree that it's not constitutional. I mean, they're just signing away their sovereignty. Absolutely.
And for those that don't know, tell me if I explained this right. The ESM was originally created to help nations that were facing sovereign debt woes, governments of nations inside the Eurozone. And in a June meeting, the banksters managed to, at least in principle, have all the participants agree that this ESM would be used to directly pay out to banks, so that these banks wouldn't fail. Now, they announced this in June as a radical success, right? One of the 19 meetings where they came out and said, this is wonderful, this is going to fix all the problems. Again, it brings us to the point of representative government in Europe is more in force than it is here in the United States, because just because they announced this out of this meeting didn't make it legal. It didn't make it legal in the 17 nations that have to vote on this, namely, as you mentioned, Germany, the biggest economic power inside the EU, was like, wait a minute, hold on a minute. How can this benefit us? You know, this giving this money directly to the banks. So it's in a holding pattern right now, correct?
Correct. And there you have precedents like Iceland, and I would suspect that Greece will take the road that Iceland took. I mean, that's what they'll have to do if they want to survive. And there are plenty of models, actually, historically. They're just suppressed. That's what I'm writing about now. I'm writing a book on public banking. But Argentina, for example, they totally collapsed. And within a few years, they had turned their economy around. What they did was they just walked away from their debts, told the IMF to come back later, and started printing pesos and issued the local governments issued IOUs, and they traded as they were bonds, you know, and they were interest bearing, but they traded as if they were a currency. So they actually just created a currency and got the economy going again without outside help. Everybody
absolutely. And look, if Greece would have done this 4 years ago, I believe they'd have been in the same position Iceland is now, with 5% unemployment. Yes, they're not using the euro as their currency, but they're doing a lot better financially than probably any nation inside the eurozone.
Yeah.
All right, Ellen Brown, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate your writing. It's fantastic. Her websites are webofdebt.com, webofdebt.com. That's also the title of the book that she is famous for. And her other website that she is president of is the Public Banking Institute, and you can read all about public banking at publicbankinginstitute.org. Ellen Brown, please join us again in the future, and I appreciate you taking time out of your night to join us tonight.
Thanks, Charlie. It was great.
All right, guys. Thank you very much for tuning in tonight. Enjoy Jeff Rins because he's coming up next. Have a good night. Tomorrow night we have Mish Shedlock on, as well as Eric Lovely. So make sure you tune in. It'll be another fascinating program. All right, guys. We'll see you tomorrow night. Have a good night. Peace.